I was talking with a friend of mine one time. He was a friar, a priest, and he says to me, you know something? If I ever got the stigmata, I would go to Lourdes and pray that I would get healed. Now, we laughed about it, and I realized he was joking. It was funny. But there's something subtle about what he said that I think is actually worthy of reflection. This idea that the stigmata, suffering, the cross, pain, is something that should be getting rid of. That when you experience that, you go to Lourdes and get rid of the difficulty. Now, I'm also a huge fan of Lourdes, so let's continue to go to Lourdes and pray for healing. But it caused me to reflect that on this feast of St. Francis. This is, as you may or may not know, the 800th anniversary of the Stigmata of Francis, which is just a beautiful event in the life of Francis. Francis had gone to Laverna, which was up in the mountains about 2 hours away from Assisi, and he was praying. And this particular day, he was praying on the intensity of God's love. And I think that's important, that we reflect that he was praying on the love of God. And in this image, he saw the crucified Christ hovering above him with the seraphs around. And in that, he experienced the stigmata of Jesus. And the friars wouldn't actually find out about this until later. But I think it's really important that we pray and reflect on that reality, that as Francis received the stigmata, it was while reflecting on the love of God. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't that he was doing something wrong and this is your punishment. It was connected to the love of God. The crucified Christ, the stigmata, the love of God. I think what this invited Francis to was to a deeper understanding and reflection on the reality of God's love across every part of his life. That when he had the ability to take what was difficult, the suffering of the crucifixion, and encounter the love of God in that, it changed really everything for Francis. It reminds us that our salvation comes about through a cross. Our salvation comes about through suffering, through difficulty. And Jesus offered that up for you, and he offered it for me. And then this is grace. He invites us to be able to unite our suffering to his. And in that, it becomes redemptive. I remember a number of years ago on campus at Franciscan, there was a particular household that honestly experienced a great tragedy. One of the kids in the household had passed away. We had a visiting friar, who was again also a Franciscan. He was a great scholar in the life of Francis. And he was close to this household, and the household had gathered at Christ the King one evening, and they were praying. There was this sadness, there was mourning, there was grief, and they were praying. The friar walked into the chapel, and the students, it was a male household, they were singing the song, Forever Grateful to the Cross. And the friar, he listened to that, and he said that he was amazed that the young people were talking and praying and singing about a gratitude for the cross. He would share with me later, he said, Father Dave, I'm a Franciscan scholar. I've written on the cross. I've studied the cross, but I've never been grateful for the cross. It was interesting. This was a priest who had been a priest for over 50 years, and he had this profound experience of conversion by praying and reflecting on gratitude for the cross. It seems to me that's what the Stigmata of Francis invites us to have a deeper love of the Lord and to be able to unite our suffering, our difficulty, our crosses to his. And I believe that when we can find Jesus in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of divorce and dementia and cancer and difficulties, when we can find Jesus in that, believing that all things are graced, we can find him anywhere. So on this feast of Francis, remembering the stigmata, the love of God, may I surrender our suffering, give our sufferings to the Lord, and find him in the middle of that.
There's a question that every feeling human being asks, a theological question. Why do people suffer? We experience suffering around us. Sadly, sometimes we ourselves suffer. And we have this question, why does God put suffering on this earth? Why does he make people suffer? And it's an obvious and a very valid question. And how can someone not ask this question when we are faced with suffering? In fact, the first person to ask God this question, as it's documented in the Torah, is Moses. Right after he gains forgiveness on behalf of the Jewish people, after the sin of the golden calf, he sees that it's an opportune time to make requests from God. And so he says, God, please explain to me why it is that bad things happen to good people. Why is it that people suffer? And you know what God's response to him was? Vira isa es achirai, you can see my back, ufanai lo yiro, you cannot see my face. You cannot see the inner meaning of certain things. And so God said, Moshe, you cannot be human and understand why people suffer. If I were to explain to you why people suffer, you would lose your humanity. What was God telling Moshe? God was telling Moshe a very profound point. He was telling him that the moment a human being can rationalize, can explain why it is that someone is suffering, they are being stripped of the very core definition that makes us human. We suddenly lose our compassion. We can suddenly explain things. And when we get lost in our intellectual minds, we lose our compassion. Because you know why it happened. Because of this, that, and the other thing. And now we have an explanation. We can box it. We can package it. We can understand it. And we lose feeling for it. And God said, if I were to do that to you, Moshe, you would lose your compassion. You would lose your humanity. God forbid for a human being not to be compassionate. And so there's a silver lining here that we sometimes miss. And the silver lining is that there is a reason why we can't understand suffering. There's a reason why God doesn't want us to understand suffering. We all know what it's like to be in a relationship with someone. And what does that person do? They always explain why it is that we made the mistake that we made. Why it is that things went wrong. Oh, you know why? Because you did this. Oh, you know why? Because of that. Always an explanation. And we resent such people. We resent them because they don't feel for the fault or for the mistake or for the trouble that one is going through. Because they're always explaining it. Those people come across as being cruel. Because instead of expressing compassion and feeling for what someone else is going through, they're trying to understand it. And so sometimes we need to go a little deeper. And we need to say, I don't understand it, but there's a greater, a deeper value over here. It's the value of compassion. I may not understand it, but I feel for it. And that's what makes me the human being that I am.
Have you ever tried to tell another person your story of personal pain, especially someone who's not very close to you? Have you ever felt like your story sounds hollow or petty as soon as you begin to recount it to someone else, even though the experience was deeply agonizing for you? If you have, then you know the feeling of emptiness when you realize the other person simply cannot appreciate your pain. In moments like these, when the gap in understanding is so deep and wide, it may seem easier to just stop explaining and suffer in silence. Nobody likes having their suffering minimized by someone's inability to empathize and feel their pain. And no one should ever have to be put in position where they need to justify why life hurts. In these situations, God alone understands what we're going through. It's sad but true that the only time our hearts reach out to heaven seems to be when other solutions are hard to find, when we have come to the end of our proverbial rope. Everyone suffers, but the history of the chosen people is best understood through the lens of national suffering. The Jewish people on the holidays have a saying, "They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat." It is tender, touching, and true. So much of Jewish life tells the story of survival, celebration, and remembrance. The phrase "never again," declared in remembrance of the Holocaust, is a mantra that befits the Jewish experience and helps to seize the future with defiance and hope. The Jewish people were enslaved, persecuted, oppressed, and virtually destroyed on multiple occasions throughout their history. In the face of this persecution, the prayers, poems, and songs of the chosen people encourage them to turn toward God, who is above and beyond all, who gives meaning to the pain and suffering that would otherwise be meaningless. The Mourner's Kaddish, for instance, is a magnificent, eloquent, and hopeful prayer that is mistakenly understood as a prayer for the dead. The opposite is true. It is a prayer of praise to God for life itself. The Kaddish is life-affirming, and it is at the heart of the Jewish response to suffering and death. It lifts the heart as the words glorify God and extol the virtues of his divine perfections. The prayer gives voice to suffering by reaffirming acceptance of his plan, both personally and as a people. Acknowledgement of God's sovereignty enables us all to be thankful to God in the face of great loss and the worst kind of human pain. We might understand suffering today in deeper and more profound ways than ever before. COVID-19 has shattered many of our lives in so many ways. Some of us have even, unfortunately, lost loved ones. We have also recently witnessed terrible floods, earthquakes, and wars that we thought we would never have to fight again. Yet we can have hope in the midst of suffering. Bitterness, hopelessness, and anger are self-destructive options, but there is a whole range of life-affirming choices that we can make. We might never quite understand the why of our pain, but we can still find peace in the suffering. We can find it when we entrust our souls to the God who made us. The story of Jesus, as told in the four Gospels, is worth reading, as in it you will find and see how the God of the universe chose to suffer on our behalf and ultimately repair the damage brought about by our sin. In fact, he clothed himself with humanity. He endured pain and loss and injustice just like we do. More than that, he died for our sins and rose from the grave to pave a new way into the presence of God for us. His suffering is the ultimate comfort for our suffering. And this new and personal relationship with God through Yeshua the Messiah will become your greatest source of joy and ultimately give meaning to your suffering.
In 1892, Rabbi Leopold Cohen passed an open door to a church on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and heard someone preaching the gospel in Yiddish, the language of his Jewish Hungarian homeland. After reading the New Testament he received from the young Jewish preacher, Rabbi Cohen gave his life to Jesus and became deeply burdened for the salvation of his fellow Jewish people. This was the birth of Chosen People Ministries. Rabbi Cohen began reaching out to the tens of thousands of poor Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Under his inspired leadership, the mission he founded provided food and clothing, taught English and sewing classes, offered medical care, and shared the good news of Jesus the Messiah. Rabbi Cohen understood the importance of not only sharing the gospel with words, but also by showing the love of Jesus to his chosen people. As a result, many Jewish people came to faith. Rabbi Cohen's son, Joseph Hoffman Cohen, succeeded him, and Chosen People Ministries continued to grow. Headquartered in the heart of New York City, which has the highest concentration of Jewish people in the world, Chosen People Ministries also ministers in over 20 cities throughout North America. Although our world has changed since the days of Leopold Cohen, our mission statement remains the same. Our mission is to pray for, evangelize, disciple, and serve Jewish people everywhere, and help fellow believers do the same. This great historic work stands on the sure word of Scripture, especially Romans 1:16, where the Apostle Paul wrote, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." We plant Messianic congregations, centers, and Jewish ministries on college campuses. We organize Messianic children's camps, conduct social media gospel campaigns, and bring dozens on short-term mission trips in the United States, Israel, and other places where Israelis travel. We also equip both Jewish and Gentile believers through our Messianic Jewish Studies program, Bible conferences, church presentations, and producing books and training materials. In addition to the United States, our work has expanded to 17 countries, and Brazil is next. Our work in Israel is extensive. Chosen People Ministries is one of the largest mission agencies operating in the Holy Land. It includes ministry to Holocaust survivors, running a children's camp for Israeli children, operating food and clothing distribution sites, and 2 Messianic centers. We also send teams of young people annually to encourage Israelis and assist our staff in their outreaches. Here are some ways you can help. Pray for Chosen People Ministries. We covet your prayers as we reach God's chosen people. And you can support the work of Chosen People Ministries by giving today. We cannot serve the United States and the 16 other countries around the globe without your generosity. Thank you for your partnership, and we look forward to the next season of our ministry and working together with you to reach the Jewish people with the gospel.
There are 2 major things about suffering. One, it draws the sufferer closer to God. It draws that person that is enduring the suffering, if they do not think that it is the torture of a madman, lunatic deity who's just wants to do it, right? If we can recognize that it's not happening for that reason, typically suffering is an opportunity, if we understand it, to draw closer to God, because the stuff that doesn't matter starts to fade away in the face of suffering. And I realize what's true and what is good. And the second thing that our tradition says about suffering is that it helps us love others and to sympathize with them. Our prayer on Ash Wednesday as we are fasting is for the people starving all over the world, that me not eating meat might help me draw some inch closer in love to the person who's eating mud today. Suffering helps us love others. St. Pope Paul VI said that people do not listen to teachers anymore. And any of you that are teaching anywhere know that. People do not listen to teachers anymore, he said back in the 60s. He said they listen to witnesses. They listen to witnesses. And so if that's true, and I think it is, then we better get down to witnessing if we want to speak to people. We live in a world that is racked by fear of death, fear of viruses, terrorism, anxieties, loneliness, depression, torture, slavery, cruelties of every kind. We know that. And I have a message right now that flies in the face of all who are racked by pain. And I know exactly why St. Paul says what he says to the Corinthians through a little short teaching in his 1 Corinthians. He starts out by saying this. I'm just going to read you the highlights really quickly. He says, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are dying, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. St. Paul tells the Corinthians, look, this whole idea of suffering looks like foolishness to the people that are racked by fear of pain, death, viruses, terrorism, war, anxiety, loneliness, depression. The idea that we should see all this suffering and go into it and suffer more seems, he says, like foolishness. And that's true 2,000 years later. But then St. Paul goes on and says, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. We proclaim a Christ who runs into the suffering and says, give me some of that. Not as a masochist, not for the sake of it, but because that's the path. You show people, right? You take it on. and you say, I'm not afraid of that. All of you are. I don't mean you. The world in general is afraid of the suffering, and we do a lot, and typically in the world, to medicate and insulate ourselves from suffering. Jesus Christ originally picked up his cross and said, come follow me when I go in there.
We have something to ask, and for you to do. I'm eager to hear it. Would you grant for us to sit at your right hand and your left hand in your kingdom? What does that mean?
So,
You don't know what you are asking. It means that when we go to Jerusalem, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and they will deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, and spit on him, and flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise.
What are you talking about? I thought the Son of Man was you.
And you will drink the cup that I drink, and be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But you do not want that now. You are not ready for it. To sit at my right hand and my left, it is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Because even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
A ransom for who?
Who's being held hostage, Rabbi?
Go. Continue south to Jerusalem.
Rabbi, do you need
I will catch up.
I can stay with you.
I said, I'll catch up, see.